And that was Miriam Makeba Pata Pata. This is Dinah Everett-Snyder. Welcome to Wide Awake News. This is Tuesday, the 17th of December, 2013. Last week, of course, I spoke about South Africa. It was the lead-in to Nelson Mandela's funeral. And now that a week has passed, I'm going to do a wrap-up of some of the things that I discussed last week regarding South Africa. And I want to thank those people that emailed me. There was some very interesting emails that I got, and also from my listeners in South Africa. That was truly a treasure to get those, because obviously I'm in California now. I've lived in California for almost 30 years. And as I had said on my last radio show, I will never, ever return to South Africa. And for me, it is not a racial issue. It is a crime and corruption issue. So I'm going to go over a few things and add in a little information that I didn't get to do last week. So I'm going to backtrack just a little. South Africa, of course, was part of the British Union from 1910 to 1961, when it became a republic and Charles Robert Swart became the first state president. In 1957, the British God Save the Queen ceased to have equal status with the South African national anthem, which was titled Die Stem van Suid-Afrika, or in English, The Voice of South Africa. Between 1983 and 1994, the global geopolitical forces, that is, the Crown, the Vatican, the banks, and the corporate infrastructure of the secret societies, negotiated the terms and conditions of Nelson Mandela's release. And on May 10th, 1994, Mandela was inaugurated as the first black president of South Africa. Needless to say, 19 years have passed. In 1994, the average life expectancy of black South Africans reached 64 years, but now it's fallen below 50. Average statistical number of 49 includes data on white and Asian populations of the country, of which the life expectancy is much higher. If we take apart the African population, its life expectancy is less than 47 years. But, of course, South Africa has come out on top in the world population infection of AIDS. Post-apartheid South Africa also firmly holds first place in the world for rape, killings, and lootings. Now, the term genocide was coined by a legal scholar by the name of Raphael Lemkin in 1943, and he had this to say: "Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aimed at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, within the aims of annihilating the groups themselves. The objective of such a plan would be the disintegration of the political and social institutions of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and lives of the members of such groups." So, of course, I don't like to talk about Nelson Mandela very much. I think it's been overrated in the media and everyone has fawned all over themselves. But, let's look for a second at his funeral. There were 91 heads of state, 10 former heads of state, 75 dignitaries, and 86 delegates from organizations around the world. We had President Barack Obama, accompanied by First Lady Michelle, and we had 26 members of Congress who delivered speeches at the event. Barack Obama had previously described Mandela as a personal hero and an inspiration to his career. Francois Hollande, the French president, and the former head of state, Nicolas Sarkozy, were there. Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, who had met Mandela on numerous occasions and said he was a giant for justice and a human inspiration. Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, who praised Mandela as a wonderful man, and she was joined by the German president. Tony Abbott, the Australian Prime Minister, who was criticized for not lowering the official flags after hearing on the death of Mandela, but assured whoever it is that he needs to assure that they would fly at half-mast for the memorial. The EU Commission President promised to honor Mandela's memory by reaffirming our collective commitment to uphold the values of true democracy. King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands was there, accompanied by the foreign minister, Crown Prince Philip, and Prime Minister, whatever the heck his name is, of Spain. They rescheduled commitments to fly together to the memorial. The list goes on. It's actually vomitously nauseating. But, I'm actually going to continue. Brazil's president was there and described Mandela as the greatest person of the 20th century. The Palestinian Authority leader paid tribute to Mandela as a symbol of freedom from colonialism. The Indian president was there. He described Mandela as an icon of inspiration for humanity. Robert Mugabe called Mandela a champion of the oppressed. And then we had the celebrity contingent. Peter Gabriel, Richard Branson, Bill Gates, U2 frontman Bono, Oprah Winfrey, naturally, a couple of the Spice Girls, Annie Lennox, Naomi Campbell, Charlize Theron, the actress who is originally, of course, from South Africa. And then we had former heads of state and government, Gordon Brown, the former prime minister, who said that Mandela was the greatest leader of our generation, a leader of unshakable optimism. And then, of course, Tony Blair, who praised Mandela for his ability to make everyone feel at home and at ease, and said he had a quiet humility to him. Let's see, who else was there? David Cameron, Nick Clegg, Sir John Major, Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton. Unfortunately, the Dalai Lama was otherwise engaged, and the Pope, believe it or not, had something better to do. Benjamin Netanyahu did not attend. Yes, I think we'll leave it at that. I mean, really, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Queen Elizabeth II and George W. Bush never pass out awards to anyone who isn't serving their agenda in some way. So when a person gets an award from both of them, you know that person's up to no good. So let's see. Nelson Mandela received the Sovereign Military Hospitalier Order of St. John of Jerusalem Knight of Malta Award from the Queen. And, of course, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom Award from George W. Bush. The Knights of Malta, yes, that's interesting. Did you know that the Queen of England is the head of the Knights of Malta organization who answers to the Vatican? Now, the Queen is the head of the Church of England. So you have to ask, why is she also the head of the Knights of Malta, who answers to the Vatican? Of course, there's a commemorative stamp and lots of pictures of the Queen in her Knights of Malta regalia. Likewise, there's a commemorative stamp of Nelson Mandela in his Knights of Malta finery. Heroes are chosen, ladies and gentlemen. They don't rise to the occasion. Upon Mandela's release from prison after 27 years, and a little misconception here, people believe that Nelson Mandela was in prison because of his anti-apartheid stance. No. He was in prison for his acts of terrorism. The Rivonia trial was not about apartheid. The Rivonia trial was a trial about terrorism. Anyway, after his election as South Africa's first black president, Nelson Mandela understood who the real power brokers were, and he understood their New World Order agenda. And of course, we've all heard this word, New World Order. Well, he actually said these words in October of 1994, not long after he became the president of South Africa. And this is what he said. The New World Order that is in the making must focus on the creation of a world of democracy, peace, and prosperity for all. You can find this interview in the Philadelphia Inquirer for October 1994. So let's see. Did the conditions for black South Africans improve after Nelson Mandela swept into power? Has there been any change for the poorest of the poor? Did Nelson Mandela deserve to be worshipped beyond all scrutiny? And of course, behind Nelson Mandela is the ANC, African National Congress. Well, the answer to all of that has to be a resounding no. Next question, is this freedom? You decide after this show. South Africa is probably the richest country on earth for its natural resources. It has by far the richest gold seams in the world: uranium, platinum, plutonium, zinc, coal, copper, chrome, diamonds, gems. You name it, and South Africa has an abundance of it. Today, South Africa is a cauldron of filth, murder, rape, and poverty. More than 62,000 children are raped every year in South Africa. Did you hear that? More than 62,000 children are raped every year in South Africa. Between 1994 and 2004, 250,000 murders were committed in South Africa that are accounted for. In 2006, only 5,000 of the more than 35 million black South Africans earned more than $60,000. A quarter of the entire population still lived in shacks without running water or electricity. More than a quarter have no access to clean water. More than 40% have no telephone. The number of people living on $1 a day doubled from 2 to 4 million. The unemployment rate doubled to 48% from 1991 to 2002. The HIV/AIDS TB infection rate is 20%. Life expectancy has dropped by 13 years. More than 40% of schools have no electricity. Is this freedom? Corruption and violence is rife. Agricultural and industrial productions are lower, health conditions are lower, and the gap between rich and poor is even greater than it was at any single moment during apartheid. So here are some truths about Mandela. Who started apartheid in South Africa? Well, it was the British who imposed segregation between whites and blacks way back when South Africa was a British colony. In his early years as a black activist, Nelson Mandela was involved in an anti-apartheid freedom group known as the African National Congress, with the goal of bringing rights and privileges back to blacks that had been taken away by the whites. After years of peaceful demonstrations, things turned violent. And by the way, when they say peaceful demonstrations, they don't really mean that either. Mandela was arrested thanks to a lot of help from the CIA, imprisoned and given a life sentence for his terrorist activities. Mandela's imprisonment became a public relations nightmare for South Africa's white minority. During his imprisonment, a Free Mandela campaign attracted worldwide attention to apartheid, white domination, terror, aggression, abuses, suffering, killing, torture, and detentions. The whites had squandered South Africa's resources and used them to build a military machine and wage an unending war against the population of blacks. So said the media. Mandela has been called a terrorist by the Thatcher government. So how and why did this black terrorist become eligible for a British knighthood from the Queen and a Presidential Medal of Freedom Award from George W. Bush? Well, let me tell you a little bit about the Mandela deal. The Free Mandela campaigns and the ever-growing global anti-apartheid movement pressured South Africa's white minority into supporting the anti-apartheid movement of the ANC. The ANC became guided and sponsored by two communist Jews, Albie Sachs, one of its foremost intellectuals, and you can read an article about that in the London Sunday Times from August 29, 1993, and Yosel Marshall Slovo, who became Joe Slovo, who staged a terrorist war against the apartheid government of South Africa. For publicity purposes, they used their Zionist-controlled mass media to bill their terrorist actions as the people's struggle. The white elites needed a black face to front their mining operations, so they released Mandela from prison after 27 years and installed him as South Africa's first black president for a price. The illusion that the indigenous people had taken back control of their country was bought hook, line, and sinker by the world, and even by many South Africans. White ownership over the land was taken away and the land was returned to the blacks. But instead of bringing prosperity to South Africa, the wealth of the nation has declined dramatically. Farming practices have been abandoned, which have decreased exports and weakened the economy. South Africa was the breadbasket of Africa, and it is floundering. It is floundering for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Monsanto and the incessant pushing of GMO commodities there, but that's another story. Did the conditions for black South Africans improve after Mandela swept into power? Has there been any change for the poorest of the poor? Does Nelson Mandela deserve to be worshipped beyond scrutiny? We have to go back to that question after all of this pomp and ceremony surrounding his funeral. The answer is a resounding no. The white control went from overt to covert. Before the transfer of power from the white minority to the black minority, the white Jewish Oppenheimer family controlled about 80% of the companies quoted on the South African stock market. They owned the gold, the diamond, and the other mining industries on which the country depended. They also controlled the media through various frontmen. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Today, the Oppenheimers still control about 80% of the companies on the South African stock market. They still own the gold, diamonds, and other mining industries on which the country depends. And they still control the media via Henry Kissinger's frontmen. The income from the exploitation of South Africa's vast resources is being funneled into foreign hands. Nothing has changed. What's the difference between the White Brotherhood's control of South Africa before apartheid and the Black Brotherhood's control after apartheid? The difference, ladies and gentlemen, is that no one's complaining anymore. World condemnation of the racist white minority dictatorship in South Africa has been successfully silenced, and the overt white control has been replaced by covert white control. The media monopolies glorified Mandela as a national hero, as an icon of freedom, while the same whites continued controlling South Africa just as they had done before, only now they were free to exploit without condemnation. The shanty towns and the corrugated iron ghettos are still there in Soweto and spreading out every day. The sprawl continues. The heart-wrenching poverty is no longer front-page news because we all know, because you read it in the papers, you hear it on Channel 5, South Africa is now free. And then we come to Mandela's homicidal wife. After Nelson Mandela's release from prison, Winnie Mandela was sentenced, believe it or not, in 1991 to 6 years in prison for kidnapping and assault in the death of a 14-year-old by the name of Stompie Muketsi. She appealed her sentence. It was reduced to a suspended jail term. Winnie Mandela has also been found guilty on more than 43 counts of fraud and 25 counts of theft. She's implicated in the murder of 2 ANC activists whose bodies were recently exhumed. People love Mandela because he's a saint. Everyone says so. Everyone says he brought freedom to South Africa. Blah, blah, blah. He's an enemy of poverty. Blah, blah, blah. The ruling African National Congress, or ANC, have milked Mandela as their political prop. In power since 1994, the ANC wants to convince the public that it's still the party of Mandela despite widespread corruption and poverty. In a controversial book called M16, 50 Years of Special Operations by the acclaimed intelligence expert Stephen Dorrell, allegations of Mandela's recruitment by M16 British Intelligence Service and his endorsement of UK spying operations based in South Africa were revealed. Now that Mandela is dead, South Africa is attempting to write his legacy and is lauded by the global geopolitical banking cartel. They are writing a eulogy for him while facing 40% unemployment, a dismal public education system, devastating poverty, an epidemic of HIV and AIDS, and a crime wave that is beyond the pale, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to read you some statistics because, of course, the mainstream media reports regularly on atrocities in Somalia, Sudan, Libya, and Syria. We rarely hear about South Africa. But what's happening there is deeply troubling for a number of reasons, and it holds some powerful lessons for those of us who live elsewhere. 1 out of 3 South African girls will be raped before she turns 18. Almost 3 out of 4 South African women have been sexually abused at least once. South African women have a greater chance of being raped than of graduating from high school. What kind of country is this? Where's the outcry? Why isn't this all over the news? Why aren't women's groups crying out at the top of their lungs? Why aren't people demonstrating? We'll be right back after the ads. All right, this is D.E.Snyder back with Wide Awake News. Let's continue our little dissertation on South Africa. Do we know, in fact, how many blacks were killed under apartheid? Yes, we do. The source is none other than the Human Rights Commission, submitted as evidence to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in 1997. The statistics that they offered related to the number of blacks killed between the years 1948 up to the election in 1994. Now, the total number of blacks killed was 21,000. That falls a bit short of the 30,000 that was proffered around the world, but it gets interesting when you tease out the numbers because it's not the full story. The report makes a distinction between two periods of time. The one is from 1948 till 1989, and the next is from 1990 to the election in 1994. The number killed for the period from 1948 until 1989 is 7,000, which is a hell of a lot less than 30,000. This means that the number killed from 1990 to 1994, which is after the unbanning of the ANC, and for all intents and purposes apartheid had ended, is a whopping 14,000, which is double the previous 41 years, and involves mostly black-on-black violence between the ANC, the IFP, and various other factions. Of the 14,000 killed during those 4 years, 92% of deaths were caused by blacks killing blacks, with one of their favorite things, which is necklacing. Only 5.6% was attributed to the security forces at the time, and usually in retaliation to attacks initiated by the ANC or UDF that had been unbanned. So you can Google a little incident in Ciskei, which is CISKEI. And then the difference in percentage is due to unknown causes and, miscellaneous human factor. But I don't want to get into the whole issue in the Ciskei, but please feel free to Google. What this means is that during the apartheid reign of 41 years, 7,000 blacks died compared to double the amount of dead in just 4 years. So let me break this down. That's 170 blacks were killed as a result of apartheid annually. That's 170 people per year. Now, I'm not justifying that in any way, but if we're going to bandy these numbers around, it's very important to understand exactly what the numbers mean. So it sounds like an insignificant number of people, 170 people a year, but of course it is very significant. But what you then have to do is look at the more than 200 white farmers dying annually since 1994, and the hundreds of black farm workers dying annually since 1994, dying to protect, in many instances, their white bosses on the farms from black attackers. More blacks, then, were killed under de Klerk's new anti-apartheid government of 4 years until the transition in government than in 41 years of government under full-blown apartheid. How good was the propaganda of the anti-apartheid movement? Let's summarize, because this needs to sink in. 1948 to 1989, 7,000 deaths. 1990 to 1994, 14,000, of which 92% is a result of black-on-black violence. And so let me enunciate this for you. This is the ANC killing their own people to free them from the oppression of white rule. It pretty much doesn't get more diabolical than that. Let's look at the socialist, communist, Marxist, dictator leaders of this last century to compare some numbers. Stalin, 23 million people. This is the purges plus the Ukraine's famine. Mao Zedong, China, 1958 to 1961 and 1966 to 69, and Tibet, 1949 to 1950. 78 million. Pol Pot in Cambodia from 1975 to 79. 1.7 million. Mengistu, which is Ethiopia, 1975 to 1978. 1.5 million. Apartheid, 7,000. The devil is always in the details, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to continue with some other statistics from South Africa. Because, of course, you don't hear about these things. Because South Africa, as a country, is now considered modern and civilized. It's been freed from oppression by Mandela and the ANC. It's a lie. It has descended without much fuss, apparently, into a jungle of chaos. Of course, many in South Africa don't really feel this either. They're the frog in the pot. And the pot is boiling away despite all of these people, all of these dignitaries and these world leaders descending on the country to bid farewell to Mandela. This is an absolute crisis, and the mainstream media refuses to address it in any way, much the same way that they refuse to address what's going on in Syria right now. There was a recent study that examined about 250 reported rapes from 2005 to 2007 in South Africa that occurred in the vicinity of one small town. More than half of the reported victims were children, yet only 9 of the accused were convicted and only 7 received jail sentences. Hello, 250 rapists, 7 convicted. There was no media firestorm, no international protest. The incomprehensible has become a fact of life for South Africans. There's a saying for this. You know what it is? Only in Africa. Only in Africa. 7 men were accused of 5 or 6 rapes, according to the study's authors. Not one was convicted. Only in Africa. More than 66,000 rapes occur in South Africa each year. There is a rape every 30 seconds. This is what they estimate, a rape every 30 seconds. You try and calculate how many people have been raped in the time that I've been talking and you've been listening. South Africa is the rape capital of the world. According to experts, rape is so common, justice is so rarely served, and so many women have been raped so many times that many women don't even bother reporting it. That's just the way it is in South Africa. Earlier this year, it was revealed that a police constable was still working for the force, even though he had been accused of 14 rapes over the past 2 years, some of which took place while he was in uniform. That follows the arrest of a police officer accused of raping a 14-year-old boy and another officer accused of raping a woman who came to the police station to report a crime. Only in Africa. When this goes onto a YouTube video, I'll be sure and put a link there. You can log on to South Africa's Independent Police Investigative Directive website, and you can see some of these statistics for yourself. In September, 2 constables were arrested for rape, one of them for raping a female inmate. In August, a captain was arrested on rape charges. The list goes on and on and on. We'll be right back. All right, something that I left off on my last show and I really wanted to address was the murder of Amy Elizabeth Beale on August 25th, 1993. She was a white American graduate of Stanford University, and she was an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa who was murdered by black Cape Town residents while a black mob shouted racial slurs. The 4 men convicted of her murder were released as part of the Truth and Reconciliation process. She was driving home to the townships outside of Cape Town when a black mob pulled her from the car and stabbed and stoned her to death. There was evidence, of course, that the possessions of Amy and some of the passengers of her car, some of their possessions were stolen. And during the trial, supporters of the 3 men accused of murdering her were laughing and clapping in the gallery while the Supreme Court was listening when a witness told them how the battered woman groaned in pain. There's a book you can read, Rex van Skalwyk, in his 1998 book, One Miracle is Not Enough. You can read a little bit about that story. There were 4 people who were convicted of killing her, but in 1998 they were all pardoned by South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Committee when they stated that their actions had been politically motivated. The truly insane part of this story for me, as a mother, as a person who was born in South Africa, and as a human being, is the fact that Amy Beale's parents supported the release of the killers, and her father shook the murderers' hands. They were drinking an inordinate amount of Kool-Aid, this family, because her parents stated, "The most important vehicle of reconciliation is open and honest dialogue. We are here to reconcile a human life which was taken without an opportunity for dialogue. When we are finished with this process, we must move forward with linked arms." And in 1994, Amy's parents, Linda and Peter, founded the Amy Beale Foundation Trust to develop and empower youth in the townships in order to discourage further violence. Two of the men who had been convicted of her murder worked for the foundation as part of its program. And in 1999, Beale's parents were honored by the Aileen Norman Fenton Humanitarian people with an award. And in Mandela's speech in the U.S. when he accepted his Congressional Medal of Honor in 1998, this is something that he said. "Among those we remember today is young Amy Beale. She made our aspirations her own and lost her life in the turmoil of our transition as the new South Africa struggled to be born in the dying moments of apartheid. Through her, our people have also shared the pain of confronting a terrible past as we take the path towards the reconciliation and healing of our nation." Now, I have to ask you, what the hell does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. It's bullshit. It's absolute crap-a-mole. In 2010, on the 17th anniversary of Beale's death, a bronze plaque mounted on a stone was unveiled by the U.S. Ambassador Donald Gibbs and Beale's mother, Linda Beale, at the Cape Town site where she was killed. They had in 2013, it was the 20th anniversary, and they had a ceremony in Cape Town at the site where she was killed. She was a graduate of the well, actually, I don't know. They have an Amy Beale High School in Albuquerque, and it's named in her honor in New Mexico. There's another school named after her. And, you know, I actually went and read the documents pertaining to this case in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee's minutes. And I come away feeling absolutely appalled at the miscarriage of justice. And just so that everyone is very clear, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was a farce. It was there to appease people, and what it actually ended up doing was giving people a false sense of security when they went and they testified, and many victims of abuse during apartheid, both black and white, testified before the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and which was headed by Bishop Desmond Tutu, another criminal who's the recipient of a Nobel Peace Prize, by the way. And they thought that they were, because they'd been offered immunity to testify, and they named criminals that were still in positions of authority. And then they went home. And an inordinate number of people that testified as victims went home and were subsequently murdered before they could come back and face the continuation of their claim. And as soon as someone is murdered, it all goes away. That claim goes away. And many people today in positions of authority in South Africa are named victims, named criminals of dead victims who stood up before the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. So before anyone wants to tout the wonders of any form of Truth and Reconciliation Committee, because we've had several, particularly in Africa, I want you to remember this, because all is not as it seems. Okay, so I'm going to continue here. There is something else I want to read you. I want to go back to this thing about rapes in South Africa, because I sponsor a clinic in South Africa, and of course, it's a clinic that deals primarily with HIV, AIDS, and cancer, and leprosy, and TB, and a lot of malaria. But we get, inevitably, all of these sick people have horrific stories of rape to share as well. So those that listen to my show know that I talk a lot about our U.S. veterans and PTSD. And you have to understand that anyone who has been raped also suffers from PTSD. And it is not often addressed as part of the rape cycle, this perpetuation of PTSD and what it does to a human being over time. So I really want to push home to everybody who's listening this whole issue about rape in South Africa, because it is an absolute epidemic and it is not being addressed by local government there. It's not being addressed in the international media. And until we can shine a light on it, nothing's going to happen. So while many rapes are due to tribal witch doctors who claim that having sex with a virgin will cure AIDS, there's an unprecedented number of babies that are being raped. 5-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 1 year old. Now, when you rape a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, they are not only emotionally scarred, but they are physically damaged for life. That is, if they live. In 2007, the United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS said that there were 22.5 million South Africans with HIV, supposedly the virus that causes AIDS. That is twice the number of HIV-positive people in the rest of the world combined. Now, if anyone wants to know more about HIV and AIDS, you can Google Peter Duisberg. He's here at UC Berkeley, and listen to what he has to say about the AIDS virus. Please, I urge you, because again, things are not as they seem. So, Transparency International released its 2013 Global Corruption Barometer report. It found South Africa to be amongst the most corrupt countries in the world. According to its findings, an astounding 83% of South Africans believe that the police force is corrupt, and 36% of respondents admitted to paying at least one bribe to the police. South Africa's Shadow Minister of Police, Diane Koffner-Barnard, said that upon reflection, she wasn't surprised at the findings. The recent murder of people in broad daylight by police officers was an indication of the nature of the country's police force, she said. Police demand bribes each time they stop a car, and they threaten those who refuse to pay bribes. Police steal from houses of victims of crime when they go to their houses to get statements from the victim. There is this issue or agenda of circulating criminal elements within the police by moving them from one station to another instead of dismissing them. It kind of sounds like the Catholic Church, doesn't it? In July, an internal South African police force audit revealed that 1,448 police employees, including a major general, 10 brigadiers, 21 colonels, and 43 lieutenant colonels, 10 majors, 163 captains, and 706 warrant officers, had undisclosed criminal convictions for murder, attempted murder, homicide, rape, attempted rape, assault, aiding and abetting, theft, breaking and entering, drug trafficking, kidnapping, robbery, malicious damage to property, and domestic violence. The vast majority were top brass. The same audit found that there were serious challenges regarding the management of discipline in the department. You think? In recent years, the police force has become internationally notorious for its brutality and corruption. 9 policemen were arrested earlier this year for murder. Last year, South Africa had an astoundingly high murder rate of 31.9 per 100,000 people, according to police statistics. That's almost 20 times the murder rate of Canada. It's 27 times the rate of the United Kingdom, and more than 30 times the rate in Australia or New Zealand. South Africa's murder rate is almost twice as high as Rwanda, Chad, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe. But for white South African farmers, the murder rate is 99 per 100,000. That makes farming in South Africa the most dangerous profession in the world, if you're white. For black farmers, the murder rate is average. White farmers are twice as likely to be murdered as South African police officers, and that's saying a lot. Their station in life, growing crops, raising livestock, and being white, is more dangerous than working in a mine, welding steel on a skyscraper, or working as an offshore oil rigger. Genocide Watch, an international monitoring agency, says there's no doubt that white farmers are being targeted. South Africa sits at stage 5 out of 8 on its warning indicator. Stage 5. This is actually a slight improvement from August 2012, when the international organization warned that the country was in the preparation stage in the genocide process. Stage 7 is extermination. The group noted that high-ranking African National Congress government officials were using racial epithets in a campaign of state-sponsored dehumanization of the white population as a whole. It warned that politicians were sanctioning gang-organized hate crimes against whites with the goal of terrorizing whites through fear of genocidal annihilation. Now, of course, we all saw pictures of President Obama in South Africa at Nelson Mandela's funeral, taking selfies with the Canadian blonde in the audience. And we all saw and heard the jokes about the crazy guy who was hand gesturing next to all the world leaders who actually wasn't translating a damn thing. And you have to wonder, these political leaders, these 91 heads of state from around the world, they all have access to this information. They all know these numbers. They all know the stats. Your tax dollars pay for this information to arrive on their desks. This was the opportunity for them to address that in South Africa, and they didn't. So I call a fail. This is D.E.Snyder. I'll see you next week. Have a great one. Bye-bye.